Alright folks, welcome back to the channel. And today we are diving deep, and I mean really, truly, embarrassingly deep, into one of the most iconic blockbuster sequels ever made. We are talking about Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, the 2006 summer spectacle that somehow managed to be even bigger, wilder, and more chaotic than the original film, which itself was already pretty wild to begin with. If you have not seen this movie, first of all, what are you doing with your life? And second of all, stick around because we are going to walk you through absolutely everything. The plot, the characters, the production secrets, the incredible cast performances, the visual style, the twists, the mythology, all of it. And if you have seen it, well, you might just learn something new today. So, grab your compass, preferably one that does not point north, and let us get started. So let us kick things off by talking about what this film is actually about. Because on the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward. Pirates, ships, sea monsters, Jack Sparrow doing ridiculous things. But the story is actually layered in a way that caught a lot of people off guard when it first came out. The basic premise of Dead Man's Chest picks up right where the Curse of the Black Pearl left off, which makes sense since this was designed as the second chapter of a trilogy. Will Turner and Elizabeth Swann are about to get married, which sounds lovely, except nothing is ever lovely when you are connected to Captain Jack Sparrow. Lord Cutler Beckett of the East India Trading Company shows up and arrests both Will and Elizabeth, threatening them with execution unless Will can track down Jack Sparrow and retrieve his magical compass. And so, off goes Will Turner on yet another adventure that will absolutely not go according to plan. Meanwhile, Jack Sparrow is off doing his own thing, which mostly involves running away from things, scheming elaborately, and desperately trying to avoid a debt that is coming due. Specifically, a debt owed to the terrifying Davy Jones. So right from the start, you have multiple storylines converging, characters with conflicting loyalties, and an ever-present sense that things are going to get very complicated very quickly. Which they do. They absolutely do. Now, speaking of characters, let us talk about who is actually in this thing. Because Dead Man's Chest has one of the most memorable ensembles in blockbuster cinema history. At the center of it all, of course, is Captain Jack Sparrow, played with absolute unhinged brilliance by Johnny Depp. Jack is the kind of character who somehow manages to be the most selfish, cowardly, manipulative person in the room, while also being the most entertaining. And the film leans into that duality hard. He is not exactly a hero, but he is not quite a villain either. He is something in between, something the movie calls a pirate, and that label fits him perfectly. Then you have Will Turner, played by Orlando Bloom, who serves as the more grounded, earnest counterpoint to Jack's chaos. Will is driven by loyalty to Elizabeth, loyalty to his imprisoned father, Bootstrap Bill. And that loyalty is what makes him both the most relatable character and the one most vulnerable to being manipulated. And then there is Elizabeth Swann, played by Keira Knightley, who in this film begins a really fascinating transformation from the idealistic young woman of the first film into someone far more morally complex. Elizabeth is sharp, resourceful, and increasingly willing to make difficult choices. And Dead Man's Chest is really where her character arc starts to get genuinely interesting. But the cast does not stop there, not by a long shot. You have Norrington, the disgraced Commodore, played by Jack Davenport, who has lost everything since the events of the first film and shows up looking like he has been through a washing machine. His arc in this movie is genuinely compelling because he is desperate, bitter, and unpredictable, which makes him one of the most interesting characters to watch. Then there is Gibbs, played by Kevin McNally, who is essentially Jack's best mate and the most long-suffering first mate in pirate history. Gibbs provides a lot of the film's humor and warmth, and McNally plays him with such genuine affection for his captain that you cannot help but like the guy, even when he is clearly making terrible decisions by associating with Jack Sparrow. There is also the dynamic duo of Pintel and Rigetti, played by Lee Ehrenberg and Mackenzie Crook, respectively, who are the bumbling comedic sidekicks that somehow survive every catastrophe through sheer accidental luck. These two are genuinely funny throughout the film, and their ongoing argument about whether Rigetti's wooden eye is a sign of spiritual confusion is a running joke that somehow never gets old. And then there is the villainous side of things, which is where Dead Man's Chest really raises the stakes from the first film. Bill Nighy plays Davy Jones, and while you never actually see Bill Nighy on screen, he was entirely realized through visual effects and performance capture, his presence is absolutely magnetic. Davy Jones is terrifying in a way that is genuinely imaginative, a being who has embraced the sea so completely that he has become part of it, with a face full of tentacles and a crew of similarly transformed sailors who are slowly merging with their ship, the Flying Dutchman. Jones is a villain with actual emotional depth, which we will get into later. But for now, just know that he is one of the best antagonists in the entire franchise. And then there is Lord Cutler Beckett, played by Tom Hollander, who is a completely different kind of villain. Cold, calculating, bureaucratic in the most sinister possible way. Beckett does not need a ship full of sea monsters. He has the power of an empire behind him, and that makes him arguably more dangerous than Jones in the long run. The contrast between these two antagonists, one ancient and supernatural, the other modern and political, gives the film a really interesting tension that runs through everything. Now let us talk about the production side of things, because Dead Man's Chest did not just happen. It was the result of an enormous amount of creative ambition, careful planning, and a budget that made studio executives either very excited or very nervous, depending on the day. The film was directed by Gore Verbinski, who also helmed The Curse of the Black Pearl, and his return to the director's chair was absolutely crucial to the film's success. Verbinski has a genuinely distinctive visual sensibility. He loves scale. He loves chaos. He loves grand set pieces that feel like they are about to spiral completely out of control. And Dead Man's Chest gave him an opportunity to push all of that to the absolute limit. The film essentially never lets you catch your breath for long, which is either exhilarating or exhausting, depending on your tolerance for cinematic mayhem, but it is never boring. Verbinski also has a great instinct for balancing humor and genuine tension, which is what kept the Pirates franchise from becoming too self-serious on one hand or too silly on the other. It is a genuinely difficult balance to strike, and he manages it remarkably well. The screenplay was written by Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, the same team who wrote the first film, and their return was equally important. Elliott and Rossio have a real gift for constructing plots that are labyrinthine without being incomprehensible. Dead Man's Chest has probably a dozen different schemes and counter-schemes happening simultaneously. Characters betraying and re-betraying each other, MacGuffins being passed from hand to hand, and yet somehow you always have a basic sense of what everyone wants and why they want it. That is genuinely impressive writing, and it is one of the reasons the film holds up so well on rewatch. You notice little details and clever foreshadowing that you missed the first time, which is always the mark of a well-constructed script. They also deserve enormous credit for the character of Davy Jones, who could have been a generic monster villain, but instead has this whole tragic backstory about love and loss, and what happens when you try to avoid grief by literally cutting out your own heart. That is surprisingly poetic for a summer blockbuster about pirates, and it gives the film an emotional underpinning that makes the action sequences feel like they actually matter. The film was released theatrically by Walt Disney Pictures and Buena Vista Pictures Distribution in July of 2006, so this is very much a cinematic experience rather than a streaming release. It came out at the height of summer blockbuster season and immediately became one of the biggest films of the year, ultimately grossing over $1 billion worldwide, which at the time was a genuinely staggering achievement and made it one of the highest-grossing films in history up to that point. Disney had clearly bet big on this sequel, and that bet paid off in spectacular fashion. The film was part of a simultaneous production with At World's End, the third film in the trilogy, meaning that Verbinski and his crew were essentially making two massive movies back-to-back, which explains both the film's ambition and some of the production's most impressive logistical achievements. The story draws from a rich tradition of nautical mythology, pirate folklore, and maritime legend, which gives it a depth that goes beyond just being a theme park ride sequel, though it is technically also a theme park ride sequel. Davy Jones himself is a figure from real sailor mythology, the name associated with the ocean's depths, where drowned sailors supposedly go. And the film takes that legend and builds an entire mythological system around it. The Flying Dutchman is another real piece of maritime folklore, the ghost ship doomed to sail the seas forever. And Dead Man's Chest incorporates both of these legends into its world-building in ways that feel organic rather than forced. The Kraken, meanwhile, is one of the oldest and most iconic sea monster legends in existence, and seeing it realized on screen with the visual effects technology of 2006 was genuinely jaw-dropping at the time. The filmmakers clearly did their homework on maritime mythology, and that research pays off in the texture and richness of the film's world. In terms of the producers, Dead Man's Chest was produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, who has to be mentioned because without him, there simply is no Pirates of the Caribbean franchise as we know it. Bruckheimer has produced some of the biggest action films in Hollywood history, and he brought his trademark instinct for spectacular, crowd-pleasing entertainment to every aspect of the production. He was also instrumental in championing Johnny Depp's eccentric interpretation of Jack Sparrow when the studio was uncertain about it during the first film, which in retrospect might be one of the most important creative calls in blockbuster history. The film was also produced by Chad Oman and Mike Stenson, who were key parts of the team that kept this enormously complex production running. Making a film of this scale, with this many moving parts, in locations ranging from the Bahamas to various studio sets to practical water environments, requires a level of organizational competence that is genuinely impressive. And the producing team deserves enormous credit for keeping everything coherent. The story of how Dead Man's Chest came together is actually really fascinating, because after the massive success of The Curse of the Black Pearl in 2003, Disney was obviously eager to make sequels, but nobody was entirely sure what form those sequels should take. The original film had been something of a gamble. A movie based on a theme park ride was not exactly a proven cinematic formula, and its success had been largely unexpected. So there was real pressure to figure out how to build on that success without simply repeating the same beats. Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio reportedly went through extensive development on the story for Dead Man's Chest, working to construct a narrative that would expand the world, raise the emotional stakes, and introduce compelling new characters while staying true to what audiences loved about the first film. The decision to make it the first of a two-part conclusion to the trilogy was a bold structural choice, because it meant the film would not have a traditional ending. It would leave major threads unresolved and essentially end on a cliffhanger. That was a risk, but it worked, largely because the journey was entertaining enough that audiences did not feel cheated by the lack of a neat resolution. The inspiration for Davy Jones as a character reportedly drew from various sources: classical mythology, maritime folklore, and even some operatic traditions in terms of the character's emotional arc. There is something almost Shakespearean about Jones, a once great figure brought low by his own choices, consumed by grief he refused to process, now literally monstrous on the outside as a reflection of what he has become on the inside. Verbinski and the writers have talked about wanting to give the villain genuine humanity, to make him someone you could feel sorry for even as you were frightened of him. And that ambition really does come through in the finished film. The scene where Jones plays the pipe organ on the Flying Dutchman is one of the most unexpectedly affecting moments in the movie. A brief glimpse of the romantic and the tragic beneath all the tentacles and menace. Now, beyond the major stars we have already talked about, Dead Man's Chest has some really great supporting performances worth highlighting. Stellan Skarsgård plays Bootstrap Bill Turner, Will's father who is trapped in servitude aboard the Flying Dutchman, and he brings a real weight and sadness to a character who could have been just a plot device. The scenes between Bootstrap Bill and Will are among the most emotionally genuine in the film, because they are about a father and son who barely know each other, trying to navigate a genuinely impossible situation. Skarsgård is a tremendously skilled actor, and he brings that skill to bear even in a role that does not give him a huge amount of screen time. Then there is Jonathan Pryce, returning as Governor Swann, Elizabeth's father, who gets a somewhat larger role in this film, and whose relationship with his daughter continues to be one of the more touching elements of the franchise. Pryce plays him with a lovely mix of pomposity and genuine paternal love, and he is always a pleasure to watch. Tom Hollander as Beckett deserves particular mention because he plays the character with such quiet, chilling authority. Beckett never shouts, never loses his composure, never does anything as dramatic as the supernatural villains in these films, and somehow that makes him scarier. He is the kind of villain who ruins your life with a smile and a politely worded letter, and Hollander understands exactly what the character needs to be. There is a particular scene where Beckett discusses the East India Trading Company's ambitions with Elizabeth that is genuinely unsettling, precisely because of how matter-of-fact and pleasant Hollander makes it sound. That is real skill. And, of course, Geoffrey Rush makes a brief but important appearance as Captain Barbossa at the very end of the film, and his return is one of the great movie surprises of that summer. The audience in theaters apparently went absolutely wild, and given that Rush plays Barbossa with such relish and delight, that reaction is completely understandable. In terms of how the actors handle their roles in this film, It is worth noting that by the time Dead Man's Chest was in production, these performers had grown genuinely comfortable with their characters in a way that shows on screen. Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow is even more elaborately realized here than in the first film. The character's physical comedy, verbal wit, and underlying cunning are all more precisely calibrated, and Depp finds moments of genuine vulnerability beneath the performance that give Jack real depth. There is a scene fairly early in the film where Jack learns the full extent of what Davy Jones wants from him, and for just a moment, the usual facade drops, and you see actual fear on his face. Real, human fear, before he reassembles his eccentric persona. It is a blink and you miss it moment, but it is important because it tells you that Jack knows exactly what is happening and exactly what is at stake, even if he would prefer you think otherwise. Orlando Bloom does some of his best work in the franchise here, particularly in the scenes on the Flying Dutchman, where Will is trying to navigate his relationship with his father while also pursuing his own goals. The character of Will Turner is sometimes dismissed as the straight man foil to Jack's comedy, but Bloom brings a genuine earnestness to the role that makes Will's emotional journey feel real. His scenes with Stellan Skarsgård have a quiet heartbreak to them that works precisely because Bloom plays it simply and honestly. Keira Knightley, meanwhile, is given significantly more to do in this film than the first, and she absolutely rises to the occasion. Elizabeth Swann begins making choices in Dead Man's Chest that are morally ambiguous in fascinating ways, and Knightley handles the character's complexity with impressive skill. She is also physically formidable in the action sequences, which matters in a film this kinetic. The chemistry between the three leads, Depp, Bloom, and Knightley, is one of the film's greatest assets, and it was clearly developed and deepened by the experience of making the first film together. There is a real sense that these three actors genuinely enjoy working with each other, which translates into performances that feel natural even in the most outlandish circumstances. The triangle between Jack, Will, and Elizabeth is complicated by the romantic tension between Jack and Elizabeth that this film begins to develop more explicitly, and the way the three actors navigate that tension without letting it overwhelm the rest of the plot is genuinely impressive. Knightley and Depp, in particular, have a magnetic push and pull dynamic that gives their scenes together real electricity. You are never entirely sure what either of them is going to do next, and that uncertainty is genuinely exciting to watch. Jack Davenport as Norrington deserves particular mention in discussing the performances, because his character arc in this film is one of the most compelling things in it. We find Norrington early in the movie having completely fallen apart. He has resigned his commission, lost his ship, lost his dignity, and is basically a wreck. Davenport plays this transformation with real commitment, making Norrington pathetic in a way that does not invite mockery, but rather genuine sympathy. And then watching him slowly reassemble himself throughout the film, driven by ambition and desperation and wounded pride, is one of the more psychologically interesting journeys in the movie. By the end, Norrington has made choices that put him in genuinely ambiguous moral territory, and Davenport makes you understand every single one of those choices, even when you wish he would make different ones. Now let us get into the actual plot in more detail, because Dead Man's Chest is the kind of movie where the plot summary takes almost as long as the movie itself to get through. After Will is sent to find Jack and retrieve his compass, he eventually tracks Jack to an island where Jack has been made the chief of a cannibal tribe, a situation that is both comedic and somewhat absurd, and one that Jack has clearly arranged for himself, which is somehow both impressive and completely ridiculous. Jack is trying to escape, naturally, and his reunion with Will kicks off a sequence of events involving voodoo priestess Tia Dalma, the revelation that Davy Jones owns Jack's soul, the hunt for the dead man's chest of the title, and eventually the arrival of Elizabeth, who escapes from Beckett's clutches with the help of a pirate named Jack. No, not that Jack, a different one. Actually, she gets help from Norrington initially, before making her own way. The point is, everyone ends up converging on the same set of objectives, each with their own agenda. The dead man's chest itself is the literal heart of the story. A locked chest that contains the still-beating heart of Davy Jones, who removed it centuries ago to stop himself from feeling the pain of lost love. Whoever controls the chest controls Jones, and whoever controls Jones controls the seas, at least in principle. This is what Beckett wants, not to destroy Jones, but to use him as a weapon and a tool, to bring the seas under the control of the East India Trading Company. It is a genuinely clever piece of plotting, because it means the chest is simultaneously a weapon, a leverage point, a source of mythological power, and a deeply personal object that tells you everything you need to know about the tragedy at the heart of Jones's character. The film does a beautiful job of making you understand what the chest means on multiple levels: practical, political, and emotional, without ever feeling like it is stopping to explain itself. The journey to find the chest takes our characters to some spectacular locations, most notably the island of Tortuga, which is exactly as chaotic and disreputable as you would hope a pirate haven to be, and various points across the Caribbean. Along the way, there is the spectacular Cannibal Island sequence, a fantastic scene involving a water wheel that has to be one of the most elaborate and entertaining action sequences in the entire franchise, and the unforgettable sequence involving the Kraken that serves as the film's climactic set piece. But before we get to the ending, let us talk about some of the film's key revelations and twists, because Dead Man's Chest has several good ones. One of the film's most significant plot developments involves what Davy Jones actually is and how he came to be. Jones was once a mortal man, a great sailor and navigator, who fell deeply in love and was given the task of ferrying the souls of the dead to the afterlife. When the woman he loved did not wait for him, he abandoned his duty, carved out his own heart to stop the pain, and locked it in the chest. As punishment, or perhaps as consequence, he was transformed into the creature he now is. This backstory is revealed gradually throughout the film, primarily through dialogue and brief flashbacks involving a locket that Jones treasures obsessively, and it gives the character genuine pathos. The woman in question is later revealed to be Tia Dalma, the mysterious voodoo priestess played by Naomi Harris, which is a revelation that pays off properly in the third film, but is seeded throughout this one. Understanding that Jones is not simply a monster, but a being defined by grief and bitterness and a refusal to let go, adds a dimension to every scene he appears in. The film also does some interesting work with the concept of debt and obligation. Almost every major character in Dead Man's Chest is operating under some kind of obligation they did not choose and cannot easily escape. Jack owes his soul to Jones. Will owes his freedom to Beckett and his loyalty to his father and to Elizabeth. Elizabeth owes her freedom to the deal Beckett struck with Will. Norrington owes himself a chance at redemption. Even Jones himself is technically in debt to a cosmic obligation he chose to abandon. This web of obligations is what drives the plot, and it is also what makes the film thematically interesting. It is a story about what we owe each other, about the contracts we enter into without fully understanding the consequences, and about what happens when the cost of those contracts comes due. The question of who is actually operating with honest intentions in Dead Man's Chest is a genuinely interesting one, because the answer is basically nobody, completely. Will is using Jack to try to free his father, which means betraying Jack to Jones. Jack is manipulating everyone around him to avoid his debt to Jones, including sending Will to the Flying Dutchman in his place at one point, which is genuinely not a great thing to do. Elizabeth is willing to make increasingly ruthless choices to protect the people she loves. Norrington is operating on his own agenda throughout the film's second half, and Beckett, of course, is manipulating everyone with the cool efficiency of someone who has reduced human beings to pieces on a game board. The film is quite good at showing you all of these shifting loyalties without ever losing track of who wants what, and the result is a story where almost every character has compromised themselves in some way by the time the credits roll. One of the most discussed and debated moments in the film is the conclusion, and specifically, Elizabeth's actions at the film's climax. Without being too specific about what happens, there is a moment where Elizabeth makes a choice that is morally very complicated, a choice driven by a pragmatic desire to give the group the best chance of survival rather than any malice or selfishness. It is a defining moment for her character because it shows how far she has come from the beginning of the film, and it is played with tremendous skill by Knightley. You can see exactly what she is thinking and feeling, and you understand her reasoning, even if it makes you deeply uncomfortable. The film does not judge her for it, which is itself a bold choice, and it is one of the reasons Dead Man's Chest feels more mature and morally complex than the average summer blockbuster. The role of the East India Trading Company, and specifically Lord Beckett in the film, represents something genuinely interesting from a thematic perspective. Beckett is not supernatural, not mythological, not ancient. He is modern, corporate, colonialist in the most literal sense. He represents the force that is coming to end the age of piracy, to bring the chaos of the seas under the control of organized commerce and empire. There is something almost allegorical about his character, the freewheeling, anarchic world of piracy being threatened not by a better pirate, but by capitalism and bureaucracy. Jack Sparrow, for all his selfishness and amorality, represents a kind of freedom that Beckett wants to eliminate. That tension between freedom and control is one of the film's deepest themes, and it runs throughout the entire trilogy. Dead Man's Chest does a particularly good job of establishing it, largely through the contrast between Beckett's cold efficiency and the glorious mess of Jack's world. Now, Davy Jones's crew aboard the Flying Dutchman deserves mention because they are one of the film's most visually extraordinary achievements. These are sailors who have served Jones so long that they have begun to merge with the sea and the ship. One has a hammerhead shark for a head, another is covered in barnacles, others have various marine life incorporated into their bodies. The visual effects work required to realize these characters was extraordinary for 2006 and holds up remarkably well today. But beyond the visual spectacle, the crew also represents the film's exploration of what it means to truly lose yourself, to serve something so completely that you cease to be a separate individual. Bootstrap Bill Turner's gradual transformation throughout this film and into the next
is one of the most quietly devastating elements of the trilogy, and it gives the Flying Dutchman sequences a genuine emotional weight beyond just being spectacular monster movie stuff. The Kraken, as mentioned, is the film's ultimate threat and its climactic set piece, and it is worth talking about in some detail because it is genuinely iconic.
The creature is an ancient, colossal sea beast that Davy Jones commands and sends to destroy ships and people that cross him. When it finally appears in full during the film's third act, it is a spectacular piece of filmmaking. The sequence was shot with enormous practical elements combined with visual effects, giving it a physicality and weight that pure CGI creatures often lack. The sound design is particularly impressive. The Kraken has a genuinely unsettling acoustic presence, a combination of sounds that feels both organic and deeply wrong. And that audio work contributes enormously to how frightening the creature feels. The sequence also has real emotional stakes because of where it lands in the story and what it means for the characters involved, which keeps it from being purely a technical showcase. Let us talk about the technical aspects of the film in more detail, because Dead Man's Chest is a genuinely beautiful movie, and its visual accomplishments deserve recognition. The cinematography was handled by Dariusz Wolski, who was also the director of photography on the first film, and his work here is absolutely magnificent. Wolski has a gift for making large-scale action feel both legible and visceral. Even in the film's most chaotic sequences, you always know where you are and what is happening, which is harder to achieve than it sounds. He also brings real beauty to the film's quieter moments, finding gorgeous compositions in the Caribbean locations that give the world a sense of genuine grandeur. The film looks genuinely sumptuous throughout, whether it is the deep blues and greens of open ocean sequences, the warm golds and ambers of candlelit interiors, or the decaying organic horror of the Flying Dutchman. The use of lighting in Dead Man's Chest is particularly sophisticated and worth examining. Different locations and environments have entirely different lighting palettes that tell you immediately where you are and what kind of tone the scene should have. The world of Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman is lit in cold, desaturated blues and greens, with practical flames providing flickering warmth that somehow makes the scenes feel colder rather than warmer. A clever trick that reinforces the sense of a world that has lost its humanity. The daylight Caribbean sequences have a lush, vivid color palette that feels almost too beautiful, too bright, emphasizing the freedom and chaos of the pirate world. Beckett's environments, by contrast, are lit in a very controlled, formal way, precise and cool without being supernatural, just deeply institutional. And Tia Dalma's home on the bayou is lit in warm, earthy tones with flickering candlelight that creates an atmosphere of mystery and ancient power. Wolski and Verbinski clearly discussed these palettes in great detail, and the visual coherence of the film across such wildly different environments is a testament to that preparation. The production design, overseen by Rick Heinrichs, is another element that deserves enormous credit. The Flying Dutchman is one of the great production design achievements in blockbuster cinema, a ship that is simultaneously a vessel and a living organism, covered in barnacles and sea creatures and decaying organic matter, with a crew that mirrors its condition. The level of detail in every corner of the ship is extraordinary, the kind of detail that rewards close viewing and speaks to a design team that was genuinely obsessed with realizing a fully coherent world. Equally impressive is the detailed work done on the dead man's chest itself, a seemingly simple prop that needed to feel genuinely ancient and significant. and that succeeds through a combination of physical design and the way the film treats it as an object of reverence and terror simultaneously. The music, composed by Hans Zimmer, is one of the film's most beloved elements and deserves extended discussion. Zimmer wrote a score that is simultaneously epic, playful, swashbuckling, and genuinely stirring, a combination that is difficult to pull off and that he manages with characteristic brilliance. The main theme of the Pirates franchise, of course, is one of the most instantly recognizable pieces of film music from the 2000s, and Dead Man's Chest expands and develops it in ways that feel organic rather than repetitive. But equally impressive are the themes written specifically for this film. The brooding, melancholic motif associated with Davy Jones is one of Zimmer's finest pieces of character music, capturing the character's tragedy and menace in equal measure. The pipe organ is the primary instrument for Jones's theme, which is a brilliant choice. The organ is an instrument associated with both grand religious spaces and old horror films, which perfectly captures the character's duality as both a cosmic figure and a monster. The score for the Kraken sequences is also spectacular, building from an almost subliminal rumble to something genuinely overwhelming as the creature arrives. It is a movie score that works both in the context of the film and as a standalone listening experience, which is the mark of genuinely great film music. The editing of Dead Man's Chest was handled by Craig Wood and Stephen Rivkin, and their work is one of the film's less discussed but crucial elements. At a running time of approximately 151 minutes, this is a long film, and keeping it moving and engaging throughout requires editorial skill of a high order. The editors do a remarkable job of managing the film's multiple storylines, cutting between them in a way that maintains momentum and dramatic tension without ever becoming confusing. The action sequences are particularly well edited. They have a rhythmic quality that makes them feel almost musical, with cuts coming at just the right moments to maximize both impact and clarity. The famous water wheel sequence in particular is an editorial triumph, juggling multiple characters and perspectives in an extended action scene that somehow manages to be both spectacularly chaotic and completely comprehensible. The visual effects work on Dead Man's Chest was, at the time of release, genuinely groundbreaking. Industrial Light and Magic, the legendary effects company founded by George Lucas, handled the digital work, and they pushed the technology of the day to its absolute limits. Davy Jones was a particular challenge. Creating a completely digital character that could interact convincingly with real actors in real environments required solving problems that had never been solved before. Bill Nighy performed every scene in a motion capture suit, and his performance was then translated into the Jones character through a process that captured not just his movement, but his facial expressions in extraordinary detail. The result is a digital character who feels genuinely present and alive, with real emotional expressiveness that goes far beyond what digital characters had achieved before. The achievement was recognized at the Academy Awards, where the film won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects, a thoroughly deserved win. The Kraken was another enormous visual effects challenge. Creating a creature of that scale and that complexity, one that needed to feel genuinely massive and genuinely alive, required an enormous amount of work from the ILM team. The creature's design draws from real octopus and squid anatomy, while pushing those elements to extreme and fantastical lengths, and the result is something that feels both recognizable and completely alien. The way the Kraken moves through the water, the way its tentacles interact with the ships and characters, the way it reacts to stimuli, all of this is executed with a level of physical plausibility that makes the creature feel genuinely real within the film's world. And the way the sequence is shot and edited, with Wolski's camera treating the creature as a natural force rather than a special effects showcase, contributes enormously to its effectiveness. The filming took place across a variety of locations, with the Bahamas serving as the primary location for the Caribbean sequences. The production made extensive use of the Bahamas film studios and various practical locations across the islands, giving the film a genuine sense of place that digital environments alone could not have achieved. There were also significant sequences filmed in the ocean itself. Real water, real ships, or at least very convincing practical constructions, real weather, which gives the film a physical authenticity that is immediately apparent on screen. The production went to enormous lengths to shoot practically wherever possible, using visual effects to enhance and extend the practical photography rather than replace it entirely, and this approach pays dividends throughout the film. When you see a ship in rough water or a practical explosion, your eye recognizes the difference between that and something purely digital. And the film's commitment to practical filmmaking roots the fantastical elements in a genuine physical reality. The stunt work in Dead Man's Chest is also extraordinary and deserves recognition. The performers did a significant amount of their own physical work, and the stunt coordinators designed sequences that are both spectacular and plausible within the film's somewhat heightened physical reality. The water wheel sequence, in particular, required an enormous practical construction and extensive stunt choreography. It is the kind of sequence that production designers and stunt coordinators will point to for years as an example of what can be achieved with genuine ingenuity and physical commitment. The sword fights throughout the film are similarly impressive, with the fight between Jack, Will, and Norrington on the water wheel, and later in the grassy field, being particularly well choreographed. Each of the three fighters has a distinct physical style that reflects their character, and watching those styles collide is one of the film's great kinetic pleasures. Now let us talk about the film's reception, because the story of how Dead Man's Chest was received is genuinely interesting and says a lot about the film's place in pop culture. When it was released in July 2006, it was met with enormous commercial success. It broke multiple opening weekend box office records and went on to gross over $1 billion worldwide, becoming the second film in history to achieve that milestone at the time. Audiences clearly loved it. Critics, however, were somewhat more divided, with many praising the spectacle and the performances while expressing some concern about the film's length and the complexity of its plot. There was a general sense among some reviewers that the film was perhaps a bit too much, too long, too complicated, too loud, too chaotic. These criticisms are not entirely without merit, but they also somewhat miss the point of what Dead Man's Chest is trying to do, which is essentially to be an enormous, overwhelming, maximalist cinematic experience that never gives you a chance to be bored. Over the years, the critical reassessment of Dead Man's Chest has been somewhat kinder, particularly as audiences and critics have had the chance to watch it in the context of the complete trilogy, and to appreciate how carefully it sets up the payoffs of the third film. The film's complexity, which initially felt like a weakness to some, now looks more like a strength. It is a genuinely ambitious narrative that trusts its audience to keep up, and while it occasionally pushes that trust a bit far, it mostly rewards the effort. The visual effects work, particularly Davy Jones and the Kraken, has aged remarkably well, and continues to be cited as a high watermark for digital character creation. And the performances, particularly from Depp, Knightley, and Nye, are recognized as some of the best work in the franchise. The film's strengths are numerous and worth cataloging. First, and most obviously, the spectacle is extraordinary. This is a film that delivers on the promise of cinema as a genuinely large-scale, immersive experience, and watching it in a theater must have been something genuinely special. The action sequences are among the best in the franchise, combining elaborate choreography with genuine wit. The film consistently finds ways to make its action set pieces funny as well as exciting, which is harder than it sounds, and is one of the things that distinguishes the Pirates franchise from most of its blockbuster contemporaries. The performances across the board are excellent, from the established stars to the supporting players, and the film does a great job of giving multiple characters meaningful things to do within its enormous running time. The world building is fantastic. Dead Man's Chest significantly expands the universe of the first film, introducing mythology and lore that makes everything feel bigger and richer without overwhelming the story. And the villain is genuinely great. Davy Jones is one of the best antagonists in the franchise, and his scenes are consistently among the film's most compelling. The film's weaknesses, to be fair about it, are also real. The pacing in the middle section of the film can feel somewhat loose. There's a stretch after the Cannibal Island sequence and before the final act, where the film is juggling so many storylines that it occasionally loses momentum. Some of the comedic elements, particularly a few of the Pintel and Rigetti gags, stretch slightly longer than they need to. And the ending, while dramatically satisfying in terms of its individual moments, is structurally frustrating in the way that all middle chapters of trilogies are structurally frustrating. It does not resolve the story so much as escalate it to a point where the third film feels absolutely necessary, which is both its purpose and its limitation. If you come to Dead Man's Chest wanting a complete narrative experience, you will be somewhat disappointed. If you come to it as the second act of a larger story, it works beautifully. One thing that is genuinely remarkable about Dead Man's Chest is how well it works as a companion piece to its predecessor, while also establishing its own distinct identity. The Curse of the Black Pearl is fundamentally a heist movie dressed up in pirate clothes. It is about a specific goal, rescuing Elizabeth, achieved through a specific plan, stealing the Black Pearl back from Barbossa, with a satisfying resolution. Dead Man's Chest is something stranger and more operatic. It is about competing debts and conflicting loyalties and mythological forces that cannot be simply defeated or outrun. The tonal shift from the first film to the second is real and deliberate, and while some audiences found it disorienting, in retrospect, it feels exactly right. A sequel that simply repeated the beats of the original would have been a disappointment. A sequel that deepens the world and raises the moral stakes is something worth making. The film also has a genuine emotional core that is easy to overlook in the midst of all the spectacle. At its heart, Dead Man's Chest is about three young people, Jack, Will, and Elizabeth, discovering that the world is more complicated and more morally demanding than they thought. Will discovers that loyalty can be exploited, that the people we love can put us in impossible positions, and that his own father is more complicated and more tragic than he imagined. Elizabeth discovers that idealism is not a sufficient guide to action in a world full of impossible choices, and that protecting the people you love sometimes requires becoming someone you might not entirely recognize. And Jack, well, Jack is the most interesting case, because he is someone who has always known the world is complicated and morally ambiguous. And Dead Man's Chest is, in many ways, the story of what happens when even Jack's cynicism is not sufficient armor against the demands of genuine connection and genuine fear. The fear is key. Jack Sparrow is funny and charismatic and clever, But he is also genuinely afraid in this film, in a way that humanizes him enormously. The film also does something quite smart with the theme of identity. Davy Jones is a figure who has lost his identity through grief. He ceased to be himself when he cut out his heart and became something inhuman as a result. The crew of the Flying Dutchman are in the process of losing their identities, gradually becoming part of the ship rather than separate individuals. Even bootstrap Bill Turner is losing himself, his memory and his personality eroding under the weight of endless servitude. Against this backdrop, the film positions its protagonists as people struggling to maintain or discover their true selves. Who is Elizabeth Swann, really, beneath the governor's daughter and the idealist? Who is Will Turner beyond his loyalty to others? And who is Jack Sparrow when the witty facade is stripped away? These are not questions the film explicitly asks, but they are embedded in the story in ways that give the spectacle genuine meaning. By the time Dead Man's Chest reaches its ending, the genuinely startling climax that leaves multiple major plot threads unresolved and sets up at world's end, you have been on an absolutely extraordinary journey. The film is not perfect. Nothing this ambitious and this large-scale ever is. But it is genuinely thrilling, emotionally engaging, visually magnificent, and full of performances that elevate the material beyond its genre origins. It is a film that knows exactly what it wants to be and commits to that vision completely, which is something you have to respect even when it occasionally tries your patience. So, to directly address the question of whether Dead Man's Chest is worth watching, and this is clearly not even a question because yes, absolutely, obviously, of course it is. The answer is an enthusiastic affirmative. It is worth watching as a blockbuster spectacle, as an exercise in large-scale filmmaking craft, as a showcase for some really excellent performances, and as a genuinely entertaining adventure story. It is worth watching as part of the trilogy, where its function as the second act becomes clearer and more satisfying. And it is worth rewatching, because there is enough going on in every scene that repeat viewings consistently reveal new details and connections. The film has been beloved by audiences for nearly 2 decades now, and that longevity is not accidental. It is the result of a film that combines genuine artistry with genuine entertainment in a way that remains deeply satisfying regardless of how many times you have seen it. The legacy of Dead Man's Chest in the franchise and in blockbuster cinema more broadly is also worth acknowledging. It essentially proved that the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise was not a one-film phenomenon, but a genuine cinematic universe with depth and longevity. It pushed the boundaries of digital character creation in ways that influenced visual effects work for years afterward. Davy Jones remains a landmark achievement that filmmakers continue to reference as a touchstone for digital performance. It demonstrated that summer blockbusters could have genuine narrative complexity without alienating mainstream audiences. And it gave the world one of cinema's great villains in Davy Jones, a character whose combination of menace, tragedy, and visual distinctiveness makes him genuinely unforgettable. And so, having traveled through the entire film, from its premise to its production, to its performances, to its themes, to its visual language, to its reception and legacy, we arrive at the same place we started, the deck of the Black Pearl, with Jack Sparrow at the helm, compass in hand, sailing toward something that is almost certainly going to be very complicated and probably slightly terrifying. That is the genius of this character and this world. No matter how many times you visit them, no matter how familiar the mythology becomes, there is always something new to discover,
Always another layer to peel back. Always another reason to keep watching. Dead Man's Chest is a film that rewards attention, rewards re-watching, and rewards the kind of deep engagement we have been giving it today.
So if you have not revisited it recently, do yourself a favor and fire it up again. You will remember exactly why you fell in love with it the first time, and you will probably notice something new besides. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please do hit that like button and subscribe if you have not already. It genuinely helps the channel grow and means we get to keep making these kinds of videos for you. Let us know in the comments what your favorite moment from Dead Man's Chest is, whether it is the water wheel, the Kraken, Davy Jones at the organ, or something else entirely. There are so many great moments to choose from that I genuinely cannot pick a single favorite, which is itself a testament to what a remarkable film this is. We will see you in the next one, and until then, why is the rum always gone? Probably because Jack drank it. He always drinks it. And speaking of things that are always gone when you need them most, let us talk about something that I think gets genuinely overlooked in most conversations about Dead Man's Chest, which is how the film handles comedy as a structural element rather than just comic relief sprinkled in between the serious bits. Because there is a real craft to how this movie is funny, and it is not the same kind of funny as your average blockbuster. The humor in Dead Man's Chest is almost architectural. It is built into the bones of the scenes rather than bolted on afterward, and that makes a massive difference in how it lands. Take the scene where Jack is trying to negotiate with Davy Jones aboard the Flying Dutchman. On paper, this is a scene about a man facing the supernatural consequences of a bargain he made with an ancient, terrifying maritime deity. That is not inherently comedic material. And yet Verbinski and Depp find genuine humor in the gap between what the scene should be, solemn, frightening, weighty, and how Jack actually handles it, which is with the energy of someone trying to talk his way out of a parking ticket rather than a deal with the devil of the deep. The comedy does not undermine the tension, it somehow amplifies it, because watching someone refuse to take an appropriate situation seriously makes the stakes feel even higher. You laugh, and then immediately feel slightly worried about laughing, which is a very specific and very enjoyable emotional experience. The film is full of these moments, and they are all constructed with the same underlying logic. Comedy as a coping mechanism. Comedy as a survival strategy. Comedy as the thing Jack Sparrow uses instead of having normal emotional responses to genuinely alarming situations. And because the film understands that this is what the humor is doing thematically, it never lets the jokes come at the expense of the story. Every laugh has a purpose. Even the most seemingly throwaway gag, like Jack's inexplicable ability to produce items from nowhere, or his complete unawareness of how ridiculous he looks in any given situation, is doing character work at the same time. And that brings us, in a roundabout way, to something that I genuinely think deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of this film, which is the way Dead Man's Chest handles the concept of consequence. One of the things that separates genuinely great adventure films from merely good ones is whether the characters feel the weight of their choices, whether what happens in one scene actually matters in the next scene. A lot of blockbusters are consequence-free zones where characters bounce from set piece to set piece without anything really sticking to them. Dead Man's Chest is emphatically not that kind of film. Every major decision made by the characters in this movie has a real cost. Will's decision to prioritize finding his father leads directly to complications with his relationship with Elizabeth. Elizabeth's growing disillusionment with the idea that good intentions are sufficient moral armor leads her to make choices that will haunt her. Jack's lifetime of elaborate schemes and careful non-commitments means that when genuine commitment is required, when the situation demands something real from him, he is almost incapable of providing it. And that incapacity costs him and everyone around him. The film tracks these costs carefully and honestly, which is why it feels emotionally real, despite being set in a world full of cursed chests and sea monsters. This is also, I think, why the film's ending hits as hard as it does. Because you have spent 2.5 hours watching these characters make choices and pay prices, and by the time the final confrontation arrives, you understand exactly what is at stake for each of them. Not just practically, but personally. The Kraken sequence works as spectacle, absolutely. But it works even more as emotional climax because of all the groundwork the film has laid beforehand. You care about what happens because the film has made you care about who it is happening to, which is ultimately the only thing that matters in storytelling of any kind. Now, while we are on the subject of emotional investment, let us circle back to Davy Jones for a moment, because I do not think we have fully exhausted what makes him such a compelling presence in this film. Beyond the extraordinary visual effects work, and beyond Bill Nighy's remarkable performance, there is something about Jones as a character concept that is genuinely resonant in a way that goes beyond standard villain material. Jones is defined by a wound he refuses to heal. He removed his heart, quite literally, to stop the pain of loss. And the result is that he has become monstrous. Not because he is evil in some abstract sense, but because he chose numbness over grief, and the consequences of that choice consumed him entirely. That is a very human story dressed up in supernatural clothing, and it is one that most people can relate to on some level, because the temptation to avoid grief rather than process it is something that is genuinely universal. We have all done versions of what Jones did, on whatever scale our lives allow. We have all put something in a box and locked it away and told ourselves we were fine. The film takes that very ordinary psychological tendency and follows it to its logical extreme, asking what would happen if you really, truly succeeded at feeling nothing. And the answer, it turns out, is Davy Jones. There is something almost therapeutic about that, in a weird way. It is the film making a very gentle but pointed argument for the importance of feeling your feelings, which is not something you typically expect from a movie that also features a man with a hammerhead shark for a head. The locket that Jones carries throughout the film is the key to understanding all of this. It is the one object that bypasses his numbness, the one thing that consistently produces something like genuine emotion in him. When he looks at it, you see something flicker behind those extraordinary digital eyes that looks almost like the person he used to be, and it is genuinely moving in a way that sneaks up on you completely. Nighy and the ILM team deserve enormous credit for making that work, because it is a very subtle thing in the middle of an extremely unsubtle film, and the contrast between the subtlety of those moments and the grandeur of everything around them is part of what makes them so effective. Something else worth talking about that tends to get glossed over in broader discussions of the film is the way Dead Man's Chest handles the theme of transformation, and not just the physical transformation of Jones's crew, though that is obviously the most literal version of it. Nearly every major character in this film is in the process of becoming something different from what they were at the start. Will is becoming someone who understands that the world is more morally complicated than his initial idealism allowed. Elizabeth is becoming someone who can act under genuinely impossible circumstances. Norrington is becoming someone who has traded one identity, the honorable naval officer, for another that is darker and more desperate. Even Gibbs, in his supporting role, has little moments of growth and doubt that suggest a character who is more than just comic relief. And then there is Jack, whose transformation is the most interesting and the least linear. Jack does not transform in the straightforward way the other characters do, because Jack has spent his entire life carefully avoiding the kind of transformation that requires genuine vulnerability. His whole performance, and it is explicitly a performance, a character he plays, even to himself, is designed to prevent exactly the kind of emotional openness that leads to growth. What Dead Man's Chest does is put pressure on that defense mechanism in ways that Jack cannot simply scheme or joke his way out of. And watching him struggle with that, watching him resist the transformation that the film keeps insisting he needs, is one of the most quietly compelling things about his arc across the trilogy. The film also has some genuinely interesting things to say about loyalty and what it actually means in practice versus what we tell ourselves it means in theory. Everyone in Dead Man's Chest talks about loyalty. To their captain, to their crew, to their loved ones, to their country, to their principles. And almost everyone in Dead Man's Chest has a moment where they compromise or redefine that loyalty in response to circumstances. The film is not cynical about this, which is important. It does not conclude that loyalty is meaningless or that betrayal is inevitable. Rather, it examines loyalty as something that is genuinely difficult to maintain in a world where multiple competing obligations are constantly pulling people in different directions. And it suggests that the real test of character is not whether you are always perfectly loyal, which is an impossible standard, but what you do when loyalty becomes complicated and what you are ultimately willing to stand for when everything else is stripped away. Will Turner passes this test more or less, even if the path is messy. Elizabeth passes it too, though her version of passing looks different from what you might expect. Jack's relationship with loyalty is the most interesting of all, because he is someone who has convinced himself that his only loyalty is to himself and his own survival. And watching the film slowly reveal that this is not entirely true is one of its great ongoing pleasures. There are moments in Dead Man's Chest where Jack chooses something other than pure self-interest, and the fact that he immediately tries to cover those moments up with deflection and performance makes them more touching rather than less. The thing about Jack Sparrow is that he is actually a much better person than he wants anyone, including himself, to know. Now, I also want to say something about the way this film uses its supporting characters, because I think one of its genuine strengths is that almost nobody in the ensemble is purely functional. Even characters who appear for relatively brief amounts of screen time are given enough specificity and personality that they feel like real people with real lives outside the frame. The sailors aboard the Flying Dutchman, for instance, could have just been nameless monster extras, but the film takes time to give several of them distinct personalities and even brief moments of apparent humanity beneath the barnacles and the transformation. That attention to the edges of the frame is a sign of genuine craft, and it contributes enormously to the feeling that you are inhabiting a real and fully realized world rather than a movie set. The same is true of the Pirates of Tortuga, who are not just colorful background decoration, but feel like actual residents of an actual place with actual habits and histories. Tortuga as a location works so well in Dead Man's Chest because the production design and the background casting and the direction all conspire to make it feel genuinely inhabited. A real port city with a real economy and real social dynamics. Just one where the social dynamics happen to involve significantly more rum and dramatically less law enforcement than your average port city. Verbinski clearly directed his crowd scenes with as much care as his principal photography, and the result is a film where the world feels consistent and real, whether the camera is on Johnny Depp or on a random sailor in the background of a tavern scene. Something I have always loved about this film that I want to specifically call out is the water wheel sequence, which we have mentioned a few times already, but which genuinely deserves its own extended appreciation. This is a sequence that should not work. 3 people sword fighting on top of a rolling water wheel through a jungle, while also simultaneously arguing about a key and a chest, is an absurdist premise that could very easily tip into complete self-parody. And yet it works brilliantly, because Verbinski shoots it with complete commitment to its internal logic, because the editing gives it a perfect rhythm, and because the 3 actors, Depp, Bloom, and Davenport, play it with total seriousness, even as the physical comedy escalates to increasingly ridiculous heights. It is also, in its own very elaborate way, a deeply revealing character scene. The 3-way fight on the wheel tells you everything you need to know about where Jack, Will, and Norrington are in relation to each other and in relation to the chest. Their fighting styles reflect their characters. Their alliances shift in real time in response to tactical calculation, and the moments where they briefly cooperate before immediately turning on each other again are a perfect microcosm of the whole film's dynamic. You could write an entire essay just about the water wheel sequence and what it reveals about the film's characters and themes. It is genuinely brilliant filmmaking hiding inside what appears to be completely unhinged physical comedy, which is itself a perfect description of the whole film. Let us also take a minute to appreciate the film's sense of geography, which is something blockbusters often get wrong. Dead Man's Chest always knows where its characters are in relation to each other, and more importantly, it always knows why that geography matters dramatically. When Jack is on the island and Will arrives, you understand exactly how far they are from where they need to be and what the obstacles are between here and there. When the Flying Dutchman and the Black Pearl exist in the same ocean, you understand their relationship to each other and to the various other ships and characters involved. This geographic clarity means that the action sequences feel grounded, even when they are completely outlandish. You always know that the water wheel is near the jungle, which is near the beach, which is near the ships. And that understanding makes every chase and every escape and every confrontation feel spatially coherent in a way that really matters for maintaining dramatic tension. The film's score deserves one more mention here, because Hans Zimmer does something very clever with the musical geography of the film that mirrors this spatial clarity. Different characters and locations have not just different timbres and moods in the score, but different rhythmic feels. The music for Jack's sequences often has that slightly syncopated, rolling, unpredictable rhythm that mirrors his character, while the Flying Dutchman material has a slower, more relentless pulse, like the sea itself. The music for the Beckett scenes tends towards stately precision, controlled, metronomic, slightly cold. And when these worlds collide in scenes where multiple characters interact, Zimmer blends these musical identities in ways that tell you something about the power dynamics in any given scene. It is sophisticated compositional thinking in service of what is ostensibly a popcorn film, and it is one of the reasons the score has remained beloved for nearly 2 decades. There is also something worth saying about the film's relationship to its own genre and its own franchise origins. Dead Man's Chest is, technically, a sequel to a film that was based on a theme park attraction, and the film is entirely aware of this. But rather than being embarrassed by that heritage or trying to distance itself from it, the film leans into it and transforms it. The Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland and Walt Disney World is about a certain fantasy of the pirate life, swashbuckling adventure, nautical romance, the freedom of the open sea. Dead Man's Chest takes all of those elements and asks what they would actually cost. It takes the fantasy seriously, which, paradoxically, makes it more fantastical rather than less. Because a fantasy that has genuine stakes and genuine consequences is a more compelling fantasy than one that is purely consequence-free wish fulfillment. And ultimately, that is what makes Dead Man's Chest such a remarkable piece of mainstream entertainment. It respects its audience enough to take its own premise seriously, to build genuine emotional depth into spectacular entertainment, and to trust that audiences will respond to complexity and moral ambiguity even in the middle of a summer blockbuster about pirates fighting sea monsters. That faith in the audience was largely vindicated by the film's reception, and it is what continues to make the film worth returning to nearly 2 decades after its release. If we are going to wrap this up, and I realize we have been going for quite a while now, which is absolutely a feature rather than a bug when you are talking about a film this rich, the thing I want to leave you with is an appreciation for what Dead Man's Chest gets right that is often overlooked in favor of praising its more obvious qualities. Yes, the special effects are brilliant. Yes, Johnny Depp is extraordinary. Yes, the set pieces are spectacular, and the score is magnificent, and the production design is extraordinary. All of that is absolutely true and absolutely worth celebrating. But the thing that makes the film genuinely great, rather than merely impressive, is the care it takes with its characters and its world. The way it makes you feel that every person on screen has a real interior life, that every choice has real consequences, and that the world these people inhabit is genuinely coherent and genuinely worth caring about. That is a harder thing to achieve than a spectacular Kraken sequence, and it is ultimately more important. The Kraken sequence is what you remember leaving the theater. The characters are why you go back. So go back. Watch it again. Notice everything you missed the first time. And when someone tells you that Pirates of the Caribbean is just a silly theme park movie franchise with no real depth, send them here and let us have a little conversation about that. Because Dead Man's Chest is the proof that sometimes a silly theme park movie franchise can also be genuinely, surprisingly, satisfyingly excellent. And that is worth celebrating every single time. All right, and while we are still in the business of celebrating things that deserve celebration, let us talk about something that I have been wanting to get into for a while now, which is the specific way Dead Man's Chest handles its quieter moments. Because for a film this relentlessly kinetic, it has a genuinely surprising number of them, and they are all really good. There is a tendency when people talk about blockbusters to focus exclusively on the big moments, the explosions, the chases, the confrontations, and to treat everything in between as just connective tissue that exists to get you from one spectacle to the next. Dead Man's Chest absolutely refuses to work that way, and that refusal is one of its defining qualities. Think about the scene between Will and Bootstrap Bill aboard the Flying Dutchman. There is no action in this scene. Nobody is running from anything. The stakes are emotional rather than physical. It is just a father and a son sitting together in deeply uncomfortable circumstances, trying to figure out how to be in relation to each other when they have essentially never had the chance to do that before. And it works completely, because Bloom and Skarsgård play it with such restrained honesty that you feel the weight of everything these two characters have missed together. All the time. All the ordinary moments of a relationship that should have existed and did not. That kind of scene requires real trust from a filmmaker, a willingness to slow down and let the emotion breathe. And Verbinski gives it exactly the space it needs. Or consider the moment when Elizabeth is left alone briefly on the Black Pearl, early in her arrival into the main action of the film. It is a tiny scene, barely registered in most recaps of the plot, but Knightley does something really interesting in it. She plays Elizabeth looking out at the ocean with an expression that is simultaneously exhilarated and terrified, as if she is only now beginning to understand what she has actually gotten herself into. There is no dialogue. There is no plot advancement. It is just a character having a genuine reaction to her circumstances, and it tells you more about where Elizabeth is in her arc than a page of expository dialogue ever could. That is the kind of filmmaking craft that quietly elevates a movie from entertaining to genuinely good. And then there is Davy Jones at his pipe organ, which we mentioned before, but which really does bear dwelling on. Jones is alone in his cabin, and he plays. And for just a moment, the character is stripped of everything that makes him threatening: the tentacles, the commanding presence, the supernatural menace, and you see something genuinely sad and genuinely human in its place. Zimmer's score in this moment is extraordinarily delicate, almost fragile, which is a remarkable choice given what the rest of the music sounds like. It is the film whispering something to you rather than shouting, and it lands harder because of it. These quiet moments are not interruptions of the film's energy. They are the foundation that makes the energy mean something. Now, there is another element of Dead Man's Chest that I want to dig into, and that is the film's surprisingly sophisticated approach to the concept of freedom. Specifically, what freedom actually means and what it actually costs. On the surface, the pirates of this film represent freedom. They operate outside the law, outside conventional society, answerable to nobody but themselves and their own code. That is the romantic vision of piracy that the franchise trades on, and it is genuinely appealing. But Dead Man's Chest is honest about the fact that this kind of freedom has enormous costs attached to it, and that those costs are not equally distributed. Jack Sparrow is the ultimate symbol of pirate freedom. He goes where he wants, does what he wants, answers to nobody, commits to nothing. And the film shows you very clearly that this freedom has been purchased at the price of genuine connection. Jack cannot fully trust anyone, because trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is incompatible with his survival strategy. He cannot commit to anyone or anything because commitment is a form of debt, and debt, as the film makes abundantly clear, always comes due eventually. His freedom is real, but it is also a kind of isolation. And Dead Man's Chest is perceptive enough to show you both sides of that coin without ever making Jack seem pathetic for it. By contrast, Will and Elizabeth are people who are deeply embedded in obligations and connections, to each other, to family, to society. And their journey through the film is partly about discovering where those obligations end and where genuine self-determination begins. Will's problem is that he has defined himself entirely through his relationships and his loyalties, which makes him powerful in some ways and deeply vulnerable in others. Elizabeth's problem is almost the opposite. She is beginning to recognize that the rules she has been given about how to be a person in the world are insufficient for the actual world she is encountering, and she is trying to figure out what her own values look like when the inherited ones stop working. These are genuinely interesting character problems, and Dead Man's Chest engages with them seriously, without ever turning into a philosophy lecture, which is exactly the right approach. The East India Trading Company, meanwhile, represents a completely different vision of freedom. The freedom of capital, the freedom of power, the freedom that comes from having enough institutional authority to make the rules, rather than having to follow them. Beckett's version of freedom is the freedom to do whatever serves his interests and call it policy. And the film is quite smart about showing how seductive that version of freedom is, how efficiently it operates, and how much more dangerous it is than anything the pirates can throw at it. The supernatural threats in this movie are spectacular, but Beckett is the one who genuinely frightens you if you are paying attention, precisely because he is so recognizable. There is nothing fantastical about what he represents. It is just organized power operating without conscience, which is something the real world has always had plenty of. Something else that I think is genuinely underappreciated about this film is its sense of humor about its own mythology. Dead Man's Chest takes its world-building seriously, absolutely. The mythology is internally consistent, carefully constructed, and treated with genuine respect. But the film also knows that there is something inherently funny about a world where ancient supernatural curses and corporate bureaucracy and talking parrot-adjacent characters all exist in the same space, and it is not afraid to find the comedy in that coexistence. The scene where various characters are trying to explain the rules of the Dead Man's Chest to each other, who controls what the conditions are, how the magic actually works, is played with a delightfully straight face, even as the explanations get increasingly baroque. It has the energy of a very complicated card game where nobody is entirely sure they have read the rules correctly, and that energy is very funny. There is also something quietly comic about the way the film treats its own MacGuffins, the chest, the key, the compass, because these objects keep changing hands with such regularity that there are moments where you genuinely lose track of who has what, which the film seems to be doing deliberately. In lesser hands, this would be frustrating and confusing, but Verbinski and the writers play it in a way that mirrors the chaos of the world these characters inhabit. Of course, the chest keeps ending up with the wrong person. Of course, the key is never exactly where anyone expects it to be. Of course, Jack's compass is pointing somewhere that may or may not be where anyone actually wants to go. That is just how things work in a world governed more by fate and narrative than by any rational plan. And the film's embrace of that chaos is part of what makes it so entertaining to spend time in. Speaking of chaos, let us talk about Tortuga for a moment, because I do not think any discussion of Dead Man's Chest is complete without proper appreciation for what the Tortuga sequences accomplish. Tortuga is the film's id, the place where the world of the story is most itself, most unfiltered, most genuinely free, and genuinely messy. It is a place where the usual rules of society have been replaced by a different set of rules that are somehow simultaneously more honest and more dangerous. Because at least in Tortuga, nobody is pretending that the rules are for everyone's benefit. You know exactly where you stand in Tortuga, which is usually somewhere between a rum barrel and a bad decision. But at least it is clear. The scenes set in Tortuga also give the film some of its most relaxed and genuinely funny moments. Because when you take Jack Sparrow out of immediate danger and put him somewhere he feels relatively at home, you see a slightly different version of the character. Still charismatic and still manipulative, but with his guard down just enough to let you see how much he actually enjoys the world he inhabits. Jack loves Tortuga in the way that someone loves a place that reflects who they actually are, rather than who they are supposed to be. And that love comes through in Depp's performance in a way that is genuinely charming. These are the scenes where the film breathes most easily, where the pace relaxes and the world expands, and they function as a necessary counterpoint to the relentless forward momentum of the adventure sequences. Now I want to take a moment to talk about something that goes a bit beyond the film itself, which is the cultural moment that Dead Man's Chest arrived in, and what that context tells us about why it connected so strongly with audiences. The summer of 2006 was a particular kind of cultural moment in blockbuster cinema. Audiences had been through several years of increasingly dark and serious franchise entries across multiple properties, and there was a real appetite for something that was genuinely, unabashedly fun, while also being genuinely, unabashedly big. Dead Man's Chest arrived and essentially said yes to everything. Yes to scale, yes to spectacle, yes to comedy, yes to genuine emotion, yes to elaborate mythology, yes to completely insane action sequences involving water wheels and sea monsters. It was a film that refused to apologize for wanting to be everything at once, and in the cultural moment of mid-2006, that refusal felt genuinely exhilarating. There was also something about the specific pleasure of returning to this world and these characters that cannot be underestimated. By the summer of 2006, Jack Sparrow had been embedded in the popular imagination for 3 years, and audiences had had time to genuinely love the character in a way that made seeing him again feel like a reunion with an old friend. An old friend who is definitely going to cause problems and probably cannot be trusted with anything important, but an old friend nonetheless. That quality of welcome familiarity combined with genuine novelty, you know Jack, but you do not know what he is going to do next, is something that the best franchise filmmaking achieves, and Dead Man's Chest achieves it beautifully. The film also benefited from arriving in a moment when digital effects technology had reached a point where the things filmmakers could imagine, and the things they could actually put on screen, were closer to each other than they had ever been before. Davy Jones simply could not have been made the way he was made 5 years earlier. The technology was not there. The Kraken could not have been realized with the physical conviction and visual complexity that it is realized with here. Dead Man's Chest arrived at exactly the right moment in the history of visual effects technology, which meant that its ambitions and its capabilities were genuinely matched for the first time, and the result was something that felt genuinely new. A film that was doing things that nobody had seen before in the context of a story that already had a built-in audience. That combination is genuinely rare, and the film deserves to be remembered partly for what it represented technologically as well as what it represented narratively. And on the subject of technology and craft, There is one more aspect of Dead Man's Chest that I want to specifically highlight, which is the sound design, because it is one of the most impressive and most overlooked technical achievements in the film. Christopher Boyes and his team won the Academy Award for Best Sound Editing on this film, and if you have ever seen it in a proper theatrical setting or on a genuinely good sound system at home, you know exactly why. The sound design of Dead Man's Chest is extraordinary. Not just loud, which any film can be, but genuinely detailed and spatially precise in ways that create an enormously immersive experience. The Flying Dutchman has its own distinct acoustic identity. The sounds of the ship itself, the way the wood groans and the rigging strains, the sounds of the sea around it, that is completely different from the sound profile of the Black Pearl or any of the other ships in the film. You know where you are, based purely on the sound environment, before you even see anything, which is a remarkable achievement, and one that speaks to the level of care that went into every aspect of the film's production. The creature sounds throughout the film are similarly inventive. The Kraken, in particular, has a genuinely extraordinary sound design that builds from low-frequency rumbles you feel more than hear, to something full and overwhelming when the creature fully arrives. And that progression is as carefully crafted as anything in the score. The ambient sound of locations throughout the film also deserves mention. Tortuga sounds different from the open ocean, which sounds different from the bayou where Tia Dalma lives, which sounds different from the formal environments of Beckett's world. Each space has its own acoustic texture that tells you something about what kind of place it is and what kind of story happens there. This is the kind of detail that the audience processes subconsciously rather than consciously, but its effect is cumulative and significant. It is part of why the film feels so richly textured and so completely realized as a world. Let us also spend a moment with Tia Dalma, because Naomi Harris gives a performance in this film that is genuinely extraordinary, and that sets up revelations in the third film in ways that reward multiple viewings. Tia Dalma is a character who is clearly operating with more knowledge and more agenda than she ever reveals, and Harris plays that layered quality beautifully. She gives you warmth and mysteriousness and genuine power all at once, in a character who could very easily have been just an exotic plot device, but instead feels like a fully realized person with her own rich interior life and her own deeply complicated history. The way she looks at certain characters, the way she occasionally lets something slip through the facade of the mystical oracle performance she is putting on, these are details that Harris puts into the performance with real skill, and they pay off enormously when you know the full story of who she is. Her home on the bayou is also one of the film's great production design achievements, a space that feels simultaneously welcoming and deeply strange, full of objects whose significance you can sense without being able to identify, lit and dressed in ways that suggest centuries of accumulated history. It is the kind of set that tells you a story just by existing, and combined with Harris's performance, it creates a character and a space that are both genuinely memorable. Every scene Tia Dalma is in has an extra layer of significance because you understand, on some level, that she knows more than she is telling you, and that everything she does or says has been chosen with great deliberateness. One thing that continues to impress me on every rewatch of Dead Man's Chest is how efficiently it handles exposition, which is remarkable given how much there is of it. The film has to establish an enormous amount of new mythology, new character backstory, new political context, and new plot mechanics, all while maintaining momentum and entertainment value. Lesser films would stop the story dead to deliver information dumps, cutting away to characters sitting around explaining things to each other in ways that feel completely artificial. Dead Man's Chest almost never does this. Instead, exposition is woven into scenes that are already doing other things. We learn about Davy Jones while also learning about Bootstrap Bill, while also watching Will navigate a politically impossible situation aboard the Flying Dutchman. We learn about the Dead Man's Chest through characters arguing about it while simultaneously trying to acquire it. Information arrives in the form of conflict, conversation, and character revelation rather than pure explanation. This is genuinely difficult writing to pull off, and Elliott and Rossio deserve enormous credit for managing it across a plot this complex. Every piece of information that the audience needs arrives at exactly the moment when the audience is most ready to receive it. Not too early, when it would be meaningless, and not too late, when it would be confusing. The writers clearly spent a great deal of time thinking about the audience's experience of the film in terms of when they know what, and that care is evident in how clear everything is, despite how complicated it all is. You do not need a flowchart to follow Dead Man's Chest, even though a flowchart would actually be kind of fun to make. Something that I find genuinely fascinating when I think about this film in the context of the full trilogy is how much of At World's End is quietly being set up throughout Dead Man's Chest in ways that you only recognize in retrospect. Characters are positioned, allegiances are established, mythological rules are laid out, emotional stakes are identified. All of it in service of a story that will not be completed until the next film. And yet none of it feels like setup in the moment, because it all serves the immediate story of Dead Man's Chest as well. This is the mark of genuinely sophisticated long-form storytelling, when the groundwork you are laying for future installments is also doing meaningful work in the current one, so that audiences who never see the sequel still get a complete experience from the individual film. Whether Dead Man's Chest constitutes a complete experience on its own is, admittedly, somewhat debatable given its ending, but I would argue that it does, because even though the major plot threads are unresolved, the film delivers a complete emotional journey for its characters. You have seen Will confront his relationship with his father and make choices that define who he is going to be. You have seen Elizabeth begin a genuine moral transformation that changes how she sees herself and the world. You have seen Jack face something he cannot charm or scheme his way out of and discover what that means for him. These are complete character arcs, even if the plot mechanics continue into the next film. And character arcs are ultimately what you are there for. And that, right there, is probably the most important thing to understand about why Dead Man's Chest works as well as it does, and why it has lasted as long as it has. It is a film that understands the difference between story and plot. That plot is the sequence of events, but story is what happens to the people inside those events. And that audiences will forgive almost any amount of plot complexity as long as the story remains clear and emotionally genuine. Dead Man's Chest has plot for days. It is practically bursting with it. But underneath all of that plot is a very clear and very human story about people trying to figure out who they are and what they owe each other. And that story resonates every single time. So the next time someone tries to tell you that Dead Man's Chest is just a noisy, overcomplicated popcorn movie that goes on too long, and look, people are going to say that, it is fine, people have opinions, you can very politely and very cheerfully disagree. You can point to the performances,
the craft, the themes, the world building, the mythology, the emotional honesty hiding inside the spectacular entertainment, and make a pretty strong case that what looks like a noisy, overcomplicated popcorn movie is actually a genuinely ambitious piece of filmmaking that just also happens to have really excellent popcorn movie qualities. Both things can be true. Great cinema contains multitudes, and Dead Man's Chest contains about as many multitudes as you can fit into one film before people start checking the runtime and considering whether they remembered to bring enough snacks for the journey. Which, by the way, always bring more snacks than you think you need. That is just good life advice in general, and it is especially true when you are sitting down with Dead Man's Chest. Make yourself comfortable. Get something good to drink, preferably not rum, because that always ends with someone asking why it is gone. And let yourself get completely swept away by one of the most entertaining, most ambitious, most genuinely crafted blockbusters of its era. You will not regret a single one of those 151 minutes. Not one.